William Ellis was a British missionary who spent many years among the natives of Polynesia. In the following quote, he explains the level of infanticide occurring amongst them, next to the occupations and amusements of the islanders. Such of their customs and observances as were peculiar or striking require to be briefly noticed. Many of their usages were singular, some remarkably interesting, and others horribly cruel. Among the latter kind, the murder of their children, violating the closest and tenderest sympathies of human nature, and seizing its victims with their first consciousness of existence, stands prominently forward. Infanticide, the most revolting and unnatural crime that prevails, even amongst the habitations of cruelty which fill the dark places of the earth, was intimately connected with the execrable Arioi institution. This affecting species of murder was not peculiar to the inhabitants of the Pacific. It is difficult to learn to what extent infanticide was practiced at the time Wallace discovered Tahiti, or the subsequent visits the islanders received from Cook, but its frequency and avowed perpetration was such as to attract the attention of the latter. Captain Cook's general conduct among the natives, notwithstanding the harsh measures he deemed it expedient to pursue towards the inhabitants of Eimeo, was humane. He took every opportunity of remonstrating with the king and chiefs against a usage so merciless and savage. When the missionaries arrived in the Duff, this was one of the first and most affecting appendages of idolatry that awakened their sympathies and called forth their expostulation and interference. Adult murder sometimes occurred. Many were slain in war, and during the first years of their residence in Tahiti, human victims were frequently immolated. Yet the amount of all these and other murders did not equal that of infanticide alone. No sense of irresolution or horror appeared to exist in the bosoms of those parents who deliberately resolved on the deed before the child was born. They often visited the dwellings of the foreigners and spoke with perfect complacency of their cruel purpose. On these occasions, the missionaries employed every inducement to dissuade them from executing their intention, warning them, in the name of the living God, urging them also by every consideration of maternal tenderness, and always offering to provide the little stranger with a home and the means of education. The only answer they generally received was that it was the custom of the country, and the only result of their efforts was the distressing conviction of the inefficacy of their humane endeavors. The murderous parents often came to their houses almost before their hands were cleansed from their children's blood, and spoke of the deed with worse than brutal insensibility, or with vaunting satisfaction at the triumph of their customs over the persuasions of their teachers. In their earliest public negotiations with the king and the chiefs who constituted the government of the island, the missionaries had enjoined, from motives of policy, as well as humanity and a regard to the law of God, the abolition of this cruel practice. The King Pomer acknowledged that he believed it was not right, that Captain Cook, for whom they entertained the highest respect, had told them it ought not to be allowed, and that for his part he was willing to discontinue it. These, however, were bare professions, for his own children were afterwards murdered, as well as those of his subjects. In point of number, the disproportion between the infants spared and those destroyed was truly distressing. It was not easy to learn exactly what this disproportion was, but the first missionaries have published it as their opinion, that not less than 2/3 of the children were murdered by their own parents. Subsequent intercourse with the people, and the affecting details many have given since their reception of Christianity, authorized the adoption of the opinion as correct. The first 3 infants, they observed, were frequently killed, and in the event of twins being born, both were rarely permitted to live. In the largest families, more than 2 or 3 children were seldom spared, while the numbers that were killed were incredible. The very circumstance of their destroying, instead of nursing their children, rendered their offspring more numerous than it would otherwise have been. We have been acquainted with a number of parents who, according to their own confessions, or the united testimony of their friends and neighbors, had inhumanly consigned to an untimely grave 4 or 6 or 8 or 10 children, and some even a greater number. I feel hence the painful and humiliating conviction which I have ever been reluctant to admit, forced upon me from the testimony of the natives themselves, the proportion of children found by the first missionaries and existing in the population at the time of our arrival, that during the generations immediately preceding the subversion of paganism, not less than 2/3 of the children were massacred. A female, who was frequently accustomed to wash the linen for our family, had thus cruelly destroyed 5 or 6. Another, who resided very near us, had been the mother of 8, of which only one had been spared. But I will not multiply instances, which are numerous in every island, and of the accounts of which the recollection is most distinct. The universality of the crime was no less painful and astonishing than its repeated perpetration by the same individuals. It does not appear to have been confined to any rank or class in the community, and though it was one of the indispensable regulations of the Arioi society, enforced on the authority of those gods whom they were accustomed to consider as the founders of their order, it was not peculiar to them. It was perhaps less practiced by the ratatiras or farmers than any other class, yet they were not innocent. I do not recollect having met with a female in the islands, during the whole period of my residence there, who had been a mother while idolatry prevailed, who had not imbrued her hands in the blood of her offspring. I conversed more than once on the subject with Mr. Knott during his recent visit to his native country. On one occasion, in answer to my inquiry, he stated that he did not recollect having, in the course of the 30 years he had spent in the South Sea Islands, known a female who was a mother under the former system of superstition, who had not been guilty of this unnatural crime. Startling and affecting as the inference is, it is perhaps not too much to suppose that few, if any, became mothers in those later periods of the existence of idolatry, who did not also commit infanticide. Recent facts confirm this melancholy supposition. During the year 1829, Mr. Williams was conversing with some friends in his own house in the island of Raiatea on this subject. 3 native females were sitting in the room at the time, the eldest not more than 40 years of age. In the course of conversation, he observed, perhaps some of these females have been guilty of this crime. The question was proposed, and it was found that no one was guiltless, and the astonishment of the parties was increased when it was reluctantly confessed that these 3 females had destroyed not fewer than 21 infants. One had destroyed 9, another 7, and the third 5. These individuals were not questioned as having been more addicted to the practice of this crime than others, but simply because they happened to be in the room when the conversation took place. Without reference to other deeds of barbarism, they were in this respect a nation of murderers, and, in connection with the Arioi institution, murder was sanctioned by their laws. The various methods by which infanticide was effected are most of them of such a nature as to prohibit their publication. It does not appear that they ever buried them alive, as the Sandwich Islanders were accustomed to do, by digging a hole, sometimes in the floor of the dwelling, laying a piece of native cloth upon the infant's mouth, and treading down the earth upon the helpless child. Neither were the children as liable to be destroyed after having been suffered to live for any length of time. The horrid deed was always perpetrated before the victim had seen the light, or in a hurried manner, and immediately after birth. The infants thus disposed of were called Tamarii Huihia, Yumihia, or Tahihia, children stabbed or pierced with a sharp, pointed strip of bamboo cane, strangled by placing the thumbs on the throat, or Tahihia, trodden or stamped upon. These are the mildest methods. Others, sometimes employed, were too barbarous to be mentioned. The parents themselves, or their nearest relatives, who often attended on the occasion for this express purpose, were the executioners. Often, almost before the newborn babe could breathe the vital air, gaze upon the light of heaven, or experience the sensations of its new existence, that existence has been extinguished by its cruel mother's hand, and the felon's sire, instead of welcoming, with all a father's joy, a daughter or a son, has dug its grave upon the spot, or among the thick-grown bushes a few yards distant. On receiving the warm, palpitating body from its mother's hand, he has, with awful unconcern, deposited the precious charge, not in a father's arms, but in its early sepulchre, and instead of gazing, with all that thrilling rapture which a father only knows upon the tender babe, has concealed it from his view by covering its mangled form with the unconscious earth, and to obliterate all traces of the deed, has trodden down the yielding soil and strewed it over with green boughs, or covered it with verdant turf. This is not an exaggerated description, but the narrative of actual fact. Other details, more touching and acute, have been repeatedly given to me in the islands by individuals who had been themselves employed in these unnatural deeds. The reasons assigned for this practice, though varied, were uniformly shameful and criminal. The first is the regulation of the Arioi institution, in order to be a member of which it was necessary, in obedience to the express injunction of the tutelar gods of the order, that no child should be permitted to live. Another cause was the weakness and transient duration of the conjugal bond, whereby, although the marriage contract was formed by individuals in the higher ranks of society, with persons of corresponding rank, fidelity was seldom maintained. The marriage tie was dissolved whenever either of the parties desired it, and though amongst their principal chiefs it was allowed nominally to remain, the husband took other wives and the wife other husbands. These were mostly individuals of personal attractions, but of inferior rank in society. The progeny of such a union was almost invariably destroyed, if not by the parents themselves, by the relatives of those superior in rank, lest the dignity of the family, or their standing in society, should be injured by being blended with those of an inferior class. More infant murders have probably been committed under these circumstances from barbarous notions of family pride than from any other cause. One of my missionary companions states that by the murder of such children, the party of inferior birth has been progressively elevated in rank, and that the degree of distinction attained was according to the number of children destroyed, that by this means parties, before unequal, were considered as corresponding in rank, and their offspring allowed to live. The Rataturas, or secondary class of chiefs, and others by whom it was practiced, appear to have been influenced by the example of their superiors or the shameless love of idleness. The spontaneous productions of the soil were so abundant that little care or labor was necessary to provide the means of subsistence. The climate was so warm that the clothing required, as well as the food, could be procured with the greatest facility, yet they considered the little trouble required as an irksome task. A man with 3 or 4 children, and this was a rare occurrence, was said to be a tata tababu, a man with an unwieldy or cumbrous burden. And there is reason to believe that, simply to avoid the trifling care and effort necessary to provide for their offspring during the helpless periods of infancy and childhood, multitudes were consigned to an untimely grave. A Malthusian motive has sometimes been adduced, and they have been heard to say that if all the children born were allowed to live, there would not be food enough produced in the islands to support them. This, however, has only been resorted to when other methods of defending the practice have failed. During the whole of their lives, the females were subject to the most abasing degradation, and their sex was often, at their birth, the cause of their destruction. If the purpose of the unnatural parents had not been fully matured before, the circumstance of its being a female child was often sufficient to fix their determination on its death. Whenever we have asked them what could induce them to make a distinction so invidious, they have generally answered that the fisheries, the service of the temple, and especially war, were the only purposes for which they thought it desirable to rear children, that in these pursuits women were comparatively useless, and therefore female children were frequently not suffered to live. Facts fully confirm these statements. In the adult population of the islands at the time of our arrival, the disproportion between the sexes was very great. There were probably 4 or 5 men to 1 woman. In all the schools established on the first reception of Christianity, the same disproportion prevailed. In more recent years, the sexes are nearly equal. In addition to this cruel practice, others, equally unnatural, prevailed, for which the people had not only the sanction of their priests, but the direct example of their respective deities. Without pursuing this painful subject any further, or inquiring into its antiquity or its origin, which is probably coeval with that of the monstrous Arioi institution, These details are of a kind that must impress every mind, susceptible of the common sympathies of humanity, with the greatest abhorrence of paganism, under the sanction of which such cruelties were perpetrated. They are also adapted to convey a most powerful conviction of the true character of heathenism and the miseries which its votaries endure. End quote. Thanks for watching.